The contract was signed in blood and champagne. Matteo expected a transaction, a seasoned syndicate daughter who knew how to fake a sigh and cash a check. Instead, he got Sophia. Standing in the sterile hotel penthouse, drowning in 40 pounds of heavy white silk, she was shaking. Not the calculated tremble of a practiced player. Real, bone-deep terror. When his hand brushed her bare shoulder, she flinched. The realization hit him like a crowbar to the ribs. She was untouched. And God help them both, he snapped. The heavy oak door of the penthouse clicked shut, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Matteo dropped the brass keycard onto the marble foyer table. It clattered a sharp, abrasive noise that made the woman standing 3 feet away from him flinch. He didn't look at her immediately. He couldn't. His jaw ached from 6 hours of forced smiles, and the muscles in his neck were pulled taut-wound tight like a piano wire. He loosened his silk tie, ripping it from his collar with a brutal yank, and tossed it over the back of a velvet armchair. The air in the suite smelled like floor wax ozone from the central air conditioning, and the cloying, inescapable scent of white lilies. The hotel had filled the room with them, a romantic gesture from management for the newlyweds. Matteo wanted to drag the vases into the hall and smash them. "You can take your shoes off," he said. His voice was gravelly scraped raw by cigars and endless toasts of cheap grappa, disguised as top-shelf vintage. Sophia stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the blurred sodium-orange lights of the city. She looked ridiculous. The wedding dress was a monstrosity of Venetian lace tulle, and thousands of seed pearls that caught the dim light. It looked less like a garment and more like a cage. It was designed to show the wealth of her father's syndicate, to prove that she was a valuable asset handed over to seal a territory dispute. She hadn't spoken since they left the reception hall. Slowly she reached down and unbuckled the straps of her white heels. She stepped out of them, leaving them discarded on the thick carpet, like dead white birds. She shrank an inch in height, suddenly looking impossibly small against the backdrop of the sprawling, dark city. Matteo walked over to the minibar. The clink of ice tongs against crystal was the only sound in the room. He poured 2 fingers of amber scotch, not bothering to offer her any. He knew her type, or he thought he did. Syndicate daughters were bred for this. They were polished, cynical creatures who wore Prada, drove German cars, and understood the brutal mathematics of their world. They married for power, closed their eyes in the dark, and spent their husbands' money in the daylight. It was a clean, bloodless transaction. He took a long swallow of the liquor. It burned a hot welcome trail down his throat, cutting through the lingering taste of wedding cake and hypocrisy. "The bedroom is through there," Matteo said, gesturing with the heavy glass toward a set of double doors. "I'll give you 10 minutes to get out of that thing." Sophia didn't move. Her shoulders, bare and powdered, rose and fell in a shallow, erratic rhythm. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, suffocating. He watched a single drop of condensation roll down the side of his glass, freezing against his thumb. "Sophia." He said her name flatly. It wasn't a request. She turned. Her face was pale, the heavy bridal makeup standing out starkly against her drained skin. Her dark hair was pinned up in an elaborate, painful-looking structure of curls and lacquer. She looked at him, with eyes that were entirely too wide, entirely too dark. There was no defiance in them, no calculated seduction, just a frantic, cornered energy. "The zipper," she whispered. Her voice was thin, raspy. I can't reach it." Matteo sighed a harsh exhalation through his nose. He set the glass down on the credenza. "Turn around." He crossed the room. The carpet swallowed his footsteps. As he stepped behind her, The smell of her hit him, not the expensive synthetic perfumes his usual women wore. She smelled like sweat panic and a faint trace of lavender soap. It was entirely too human. He reached for the top of her dress. His knuckles brushed the skin of her spine, and she jolted as if he had held a match to her flesh. He paused, his hands hovering in the air. "Stand still," he muttered. He found the hidden metal tab of the zipper. It was buried under layers of stiff lace. He tugged it downward. The teeth parted with a harsh, tearing sound. As the rigid bodice loosened, she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. The dress didn't fall. It was too heavy, structured with boning and wire. "Push it down," he instructed, stepping back. He didn't want to touch her more than necessary. This was a duty, a box to check. The families required a consummation to finalize the treaty. By tomorrow morning, the sheets needed to be messed, the marriage legally binding in the eyes of the old men who ran their lives. She wriggled her shoulders, pushing the heavy fabric down. It pooled at her feet in a massive, shimmering puddle. She stepped out of it, leaving the cage behind. Matteo's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, involuntary hitch. She wasn't wearing imported French lace lingerie. There were no garters, no sheer silk designed to provoke. She was wearing plain white cotton underwear, utilitarian, the kind of garments a schoolgirl wore. Her skin was covered in a fine layer of goosebumps, her ribs visibly rising and falling under the harsh overhead light. She crossed her arms over her chest, shivering, though the room was comfortably warm. Matteo stared at the harsh lines of her collarbones, the bruised-looking skin under her eyes. A cold, ugly feeling began to coil in his gut, a sudden jarring disconnect between the world he knew and the reality standing barefoot in front of him. "Go to the bed," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp edge. She nodded once, a jerky robotic motion, and walked toward the double doors. The bedroom was swallowed in shadows, illuminated only by the ambient glow of the city filtering through the sheer curtains. The bed was massive, a sprawling expanse of pristine white linens that looked more like an altar than a place to sleep. Sophia sat on the edge of the mattress. She didn't pull the covers up. She just sat there, her hands gripping the edge of the bed so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air vents and the distant, muffled wail of a police siren miles below. Matteo followed her in. He unbuttoned his shirt, shedding the expensive wool and tossing it onto a bench. He was a man built by violence. His torso was mapped with faded scars, souvenirs from a life she was now permanently tethered to. He expected her to look away to show disgust or polite indifference. But she stared at the ridge of a knife scar on his ribs, her eyes tracking the jagged line with a morbid, terrified fascination. He sat down beside her. The mattress dipped under his weight. She immediately shifted her weight in the opposite direction, leaning away from him. "Relax," he said. It sounded like an order, not a comfort. He didn't know how to comfort. He knew how to break, how to negotiate, how to intimidate. Tenderness was a foreign language he had never bothered to learn. He reached out and cupped her jaw. Her skin was ice cold. She clamped her eyes shut, her eyelashes trembling furiously against her cheeks. She was bracing for impact. Matteo frowned. This was wrong. The rhythm was entirely off. He leaned in and pressed his mouth to hers. It was like kissing a statue. Her lips were pressed tightly together, unyielding. There was no parted breath, no leaning into the touch. She sat rigid, enduring him. He slid his hand to the back of her neck, trying to tilt her head back, trying to force some kind of reaction. His thumb brushed the erratic, hammering pulse at her throat. It was racing so fast it felt like a bird trapped under glass. He pulled back. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. She opened her eyes. They were wet. The tears hadn't fallen yet, but they were there, pooling in the corners, catching the dim light. Matteo's chest tightened. Annoyance flared first. Annoyance at her father, at the situation, at the messy, complicated reality of a crying bride. He shifted his knee, bumping against her thigh. He slid his hand down her side, resting his palm flat against her stomach. Her muscles seized beneath his touch. He pushed her gently backward. She let him maneuver her lying flat on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling like a patient waiting for a surgeon's knife. Matteo bracketed her body with his arms. He looked down at her, at the tense line of her mouth, the shallow way her chest rose and fell. He slid his hand lower, brushing past her hip. She let out a sharp, choked gasp and clamped her legs together. It wasn't a modest pivot. It was a violent, involuntary reflex. Her hands flew down, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't!" she choked out. The word was a sob. Matteo froze. His pulse pounded in his ears, heavy and thick. He looked at her hands, white-knuckled around his wrist, and then up at her face. The sheer terror in her eyes wasn't just wedding night jitters. It was the primal panic of the absolute unknown. The math clicked into place. The plain cotton underwear, the extreme physical rigidity, the fact that her father had kept her locked away at an estate in Palermo, supposedly for her safety, while the rest of the family ran the streets. Sophia. Matteo said, his voice suddenly hollow. "How old are you?" She swallowed hard, tears finally spilling over her temples and soaking into the pillowcase. 20, she whispered. "And before me." He trailed off. He couldn't even finish the sentence. The absurdity of it tasted metallic in his mouth. She shook her head, a frantic, side-to-side motion on the pillow. "No one. Never. Just. Please get it over with." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. Get it over with. Like a beating. Like a punishment. Matteo ripped his hand out of her grasp and pushed himself off the bed. He stumbled backward, his calves hitting the edge of a heavy oak dresser. The impact sent a dull ache up his legs, but he barely registered it. He stared at her lying there, curled slightly inward, now protecting herself. He was 28. He had killed men. He had ordered the destruction of warehouses, ruined lives, manipulated the law, and slept with women who knew exactly what they wanted from him and how to get it. He was a monster. Yes, but he was a monster with a code. He didn't take from those who had nothing to give. Her father had sold him a virgin, a sacrifice, handed over to a butcher to settle a debt. A wave of nausea washed over him, quickly swallowed by a sudden, blinding rage. It wasn't a cold, calculated anger. It was hot, messy, and entirely out of his control. He turned and slammed his fist into the top of the oak dresser. The wood didn't yield, and the skin over his knuckles split, pain flaring hot and sharp up his forearm. Sophia flinched violently at the sound, letting out a small, terrified squeak, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Don't move." Matteo snarled the words tearing out of his throat. He wasn't yelling at her, but he couldn't modulate his volume. His chest was heaving. He paced to the window, ran a hand through his hair, gripping the strands, tight enough to hurt. He wanted to tear the hotel room apart. He wanted to drag her father out of whatever safe house he was hiding in and beat him unconscious. He looked back at the bed. Sophia was trembling so hard the mattress vibrated. She looked so incredibly small. The rage inside him suddenly shifted, fracturing into something darker, heavier. Possessiveness. A grim, twisted guilt mixed with a sudden, overwhelming urge to shield her from the very world he commanded. He had lost control. The detached, pragmatic boss was gone, leaving behind a man suffocating in a hotel room with a terrified girl who was legally his, whom he suddenly, desperately, didn't want to break. The blood dripped from his knuckles. 1 drop. 2. They hit the thick beige carpet with a dull, heavy silence, sinking into the fibers and leaving dark, irreversible stains. Matteo watched the second drop fall. The rhythmic visual proof of his own pulse grounded him, pulling him back from the blind, white-hot edge of his temper. Behind him on the bed, Sophia let out a ragged, trembling breath. It sounded like a rusted hinge giving way. Matteo didn't turn around. He couldn't. If he looked at her again, huddled and bracing for a violation, he was going to walk out the door, take the elevator down to the lobby, and drive straight to her father's estate with a loaded gun. Instead, he walked into the ensuite bathroom. He pushed the heavy glass door open with his shoulder, not wanting to get blood on the handle. The fluorescent lights flickered on, automatically humming with a harsh, sterile buzz that hurt his eyes. He leaned over the marble sink and shoved his hand under the faucet, cranking the cold water all the way up. The freezing stream hit his split skin. It stung like hell. He welcomed it. The physical pain was clean, simple. It made sense. The pink swirl of water spiraled down the stainless steel drain, washing away the immediate evidence of his lack of control. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. His jaw was covered in dark stubble. His eyes were hard, exhausted, underlined by deep shadows. He looked exactly like the brutal enforcer he had spent the last decade becoming. No wonder she was terrified. He was terrifying. He grabbed a thick white hand towel from the rack and wrapped it tightly around his fist, applying brutal pressure to stop the bleeding. Then he opened his leather duffel bag sitting on the bathroom vanity. He dug past the holstered Glock and spare magazines, pulling out a faded dark grey cotton Henley. He walked back into the bedroom. Sophia hadn't moved an inch. She was still curled on her side, her arms wrapped defensively around her ribs, staring blankly at the wall. The plain white cotton underwear made her look like a child playing dress-up in a nightmare. Matteo stopped at the foot of the bed. He threw the grey shirt. It landed softly on the mattress next to her hip. "Put it on," he said. His voice was completely flat. The anger was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating exhaustion. Sophia flinched at his voice, her eyes darting to his face, then to the shirt, then to his bloody towel-wrapped hand. She didn't reach for the cotton. "I won't look," Matteo added, turning his back to her and walking toward the velvet armchair near the window. "Just put it on Sophia." He sat heavily in the chair, the velvet crushing under his weight. He kept his eyes fixed on the city skyline. Sirens wailed again, distant and anonymous. He listened to the rustle of fabric behind him. It took a long time. She was shaking so badly he could hear the faint, uneven shifting of the mattress springs. When the rustling stopped, the silence stretched thick and suffocating. "Your father, Matteo, finally spoke to the glass window. Told me you knew the score. He told me you understood the arrangement." "I do." Her voice came from the bed, thin and weak. Matteo turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The Henley swallowed her. The collar hung off one shoulder, exposing a sharp collarbone, and the sleeves fell several inches past her fingertips. The grey cotton made her skin look even paler, but at least she was covered. At least the clinical jarring exposure was over. "You understand the arrangement?" Matteo repeated the words, tasting like ash. "Do you even know who I am?" Sophia swallowed her throat, bobbing visibly. "You're Matteo. You run the docks. You broke the Rossi family last year." "I killed the Rossi family last year," he corrected her, brutally honest. There was no point in dressing it up. And your father handed you to me, a man who butchers his rivals without mentioning that you've been kept in a glass box your whole life." Sophia looked down at her lap. Her hands were buried in the overly long sleeves, twisting the fabric into knots. "He said it made me more valuable, a pristine asset, to seal the treaty." The words turned Matteo's stomach. A pristine asset, like a vintage car or an uncut diamond. "And you thought I was just going to cash you in tonight," Matteo said. She looked up, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate spark of confusion. "Aren't you—" "No." The word left his mouth before he could even process the implication. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his wrapped hand throbbing in time with his heartbeat. "I don't rape terrified girls, Sophia. I kill men who cross me. I extort businesses. I do a lot of unforgivable things. But I don't do this." Sophia stared at him. The air in the room seemed to stall. She was trying to read him, searching his face for the lie for the trap. In her world, mercy was always a setup for a deeper cruelty. "But the contract," she whispered, her voice dropping to a frantic hush. "The families. They expect. They need proof tomorrow." Matteo looked down at his right hand. The white towel was already blooming with a fresh circle of dark red. "Let me worry about tomorrow," he said. He leaned his head back against the velvet chair and closed his eyes. "Go to sleep." By 3 a.m., the temperature in the penthouse had dropped. The central air was aggressive, pumping a steady stream of manufactured chill into the room. Matteo hadn't moved from the velvet armchair. His eyes were open, tracking the slow crawl of headlights on the highway miles below. His right hand throbbed a persistent dull ache that climbed up his forearm. The towel was soaked through the blood, drying into a stiff, dark crust. On the bed, Sophia lay perfectly still. She wasn't asleep. He knew she wasn't. Her breathing was too controlled, too shallow. She was playing dead, hoping the predator in the corner of the room would lose interest. He let out a slow breath, the sound scraping loudly in the quiet. He pushed himself out of the chair. His joints popped stiff from the awkward angle. As he stood, Sophia's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary sound. Matteo ignored it. He walked over to the minibar, bypassed the liquor, and found the small electric kettle. He filled it with bottled water and clicked it on. The low, rising hum of heating water filled the space, a strangely domestic noise in the middle of a mafia transaction. He ripped open a foil packet of peppermint tea, dropped the bag into a ceramic mug, and waited. The smell of peppermint hit the air sharp, medicinal, and clean. It cut through the cloying scent of the hotel lilies. He poured the water, pulled the tea bag out, and walked over to the bed. He stopped 3 feet away. "Sit up," he said quietly. Sophia's eyes snapped open. She hesitated, then slowly pushed herself up, pulling the thick white duvet with her, holding it against her chest like a shield. Matteo stepped forward and placed the hot mug on the oak nightstand next to her. "Drink it," he said, taking a deliberate step backward, giving her space. "You're shivering. Your lips are blue." Sophia looked at the steaming mug, then up at him. She reached out her fingers, pale and trembling, and wrapped her hands around the ceramic. The heat seemed to ground her. She brought it to her lips and took a small sip. Matteo watched her throat work as she swallowed. "Better." She nodded once, a jerky motion. "Thank you." It was the first polite thing she had said all night. The normalcy of it was jarring. Matteo turned to head back to his chair, but her voice stopped him. "You're bleeding on the carpet." He paused, looking down. He had squeezed his fist involuntarily, and a fresh drop of blood had bypassed the crusted towel, splattering against the rug. "It's the hotel's problem," Matteo muttered. "It's going to get infected," Sophia said. Her voice was slightly steadier now, warmed by the tea, or perhaps by the realization that he hadn't attacked her in the dark. Matteo let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I've had worse." "I know." She looked at his chest, at the scars partially visible where his shirt was unbuttoned. "But you can't just leave it wrapped in a dirty towel." She set the tea down on the nightstand. She pushed the duvet off and slid her legs over the side of the bed. The grey cotton Henley rode up slightly on her thighs. She stood her bare feet sinking into the carpet and walked toward the bathroom. Matteo watched her, utterly bewildered. She was terrified of him, yet she was walking with purpose. A moment later, she returned, carrying a small plastic first aid kit she must have found under the bathroom sink. She stopped a few feet from him, her posture rigid again. She gestured to the edge of the bed. "Sit," she said. It wasn't an order. It was a nervous request. Matteo stared at her. He could have told her no. He could have told her to get back in bed. But the sheer absurdity of the situation, the virgin bride offering to play nurse to the syndicate boss on their wedding night, paralyzed him. He walked to the bed and sat down on the very edge. Sophia pulled the small desk chair over, sitting facing him. Their knees were inches apart. He could smell her again, the lingering lavender soap masked now by the sharp peppermint, and beneath it, all the sour tang of fading adrenaline. She reached out. Her hands hovered in the air for a second, shaking slightly before she gently took his wrapped fist. Her fingers were freezing. Matteo sucked in a breath through his teeth, not from the pain in his hand, but from the sudden, shocking contrast of her touch. It wasn't violent. It wasn't transactional. She carefully unwound the bloody towel. The fabric pulled at the clotted skin on his knuckles, and he twitched. Sophia froze, looking up at his face, her dark eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Keep going," he said, his voice tight. She peeled the rest of the towel away, exposing the torn, swollen flesh over his knuckles. The wood of the dresser had splintered, leaving tiny shards in the cuts. Sophia opened the kit. She pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic and a stack of gauze. "This is going to sting," she warned, uncapping the bottle. She poured the clear liquid over his knuckles. It burned like fire. Matteo's jaw clamped shut, the muscles jumping in his cheek, but he didn't pull his hand away. Sophia took a pair of plastic tweezers and leaned in closer. Her hair, the elaborate updo, now falling apart in messy strands, brushed against his bare forearm. The soft phantom touch sent a bizarre jolt up his spine. She worked in absolute silence, her brow furrowed in concentration as she picked 2 tiny splinters of oak out of his torn skin. He watched her face. The heavy bridal makeup was smudged, the mascara flaking under her eyes. She looked exhausted, bruised by the sheer emotional weight of the last 24 hours. Yet her hands were surprisingly steady as she worked on him. She wiped the excess blood away with a clean square of gauze, then unrolled a white bandage, wrapping it tightly but carefully around his hand, securing it with tape. When she finished, she didn't let go immediately. She sat there, her small, pale hands holding his large, bandaged one. Matteo looked at their joined hands. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer the deafening, panic-laced silence of the foyer. It was heavy, cautious, and intensely complicated. "Tomorrow morning," Matteo said softly, breaking the quiet. "I will cut my arm. We will put the blood on the sheets. We will call the front desk, have the maids take it, and the rumor will make it to the bosses before we even eat breakfast." Sophia slowly lifted her gaze from his hand to his eyes. The fear was still there, lurking in the depths. but something else had joined it, a profound, aching confusion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Matteo pulled his hand back, gently breaking the physical contact. He stood up, putting the safe distance of the room back between them. "Because," he said, looking at the blood-stained towel discarded on the floor, "I refuse to be exactly what they think I am." The dawn didn't break. It bled through the sheer hotel curtains in a dirty smog-filtered yellow. Matteo was already awake. He hadn't slept, merely existed in a state of suspended hypervigilant animation in the velvet armchair. His right hand throbbed with a steady metronomic rhythm, a dull ache that synchronized with his heartbeat. The white medical tape Sophia had applied hours ago was now stained with a faint, oxidized ring of brown at the center. He stood up. His lower back protested the muscles stiff and unyielding from the awkward angle of the chair. The air in the penthouse felt stale, smelling faintly of the city's exhaust-dried sweat and the lingering, sharp ghost of peppermint tea. Sophia was still asleep. She had retreated to the absolute furthest edge of the massive mattress, curled tightly around a spare pillow. The grey cotton Henley was twisted around her thighs, rising and falling with her slow, even breaths. Exhaustion had finally overridden her terror, dragging her into a heavy, dreamless unconsciousness. Matteo watched her for a long moment. Then he walked over to his leather duffel bag resting on the luggage rack. He bypassed the heavy weight of his holstered Glock and dug into the narrow side pocket, his fingers closing around the cold steel of a slim black folding knife. He walked to the side of the bed where he was supposed to have spent the night. The sheets on his side were pristine, unforgivably, dangerously clean. In his world, a lack of evidence was a conviction. He flicked his thumb against the mechanism. The blade snapped open with a muted, lethal click. It was a tool he usually reserved for cutting zip ties or prying open wooden crates at the docks. Matteo held his left forearm out over the mattress. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the razor-sharp edge of the blade against the fleshy underside of his arm, right below the elbow, and pulled. The cut was shallow, but perfectly measured, about 3 inches long. The pain was immediate and sharp, a clean, biting slice that burned instantly. Blood welled up in a thick line, a bright, shocking crimson against his olive skin. He turned his arm, letting the heavy, warm drops fall onto the high thread-count white cotton. 1 drop. 3. 5. He lowered his arm and smeared the pooling blood slightly with the back of his thumb. He needed it to look messy, organic. He needed it to look like the violent loss of innocence the syndicate expected. A sharp intake of air broke the silence behind him. Matteo didn't jump. He finished wiping the bloody edge of the blade on a tissue from the nightstand and snapped the knife shut. He clamped the tissue over his bleeding arm and turned around. Sophia was propped up on one elbow. Her hair was a chaotic dark tangle, and the sleep was already entirely gone from her eyes. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the vivid red stain blooming on the sheets, her face draining of whatever color the night's rest had restored. "Keeping my word," Matteo said. His voice was gravelly dry from lack of sleep. He walked into the bathroom, turned on the tap and grabbed a white washcloth. He ran it under the cold water, wrung it out, and pressed it hard against the cut on his arm to staunch the flow. When he walked back into the bedroom, Sophia hadn't moved. She was still staring at the blood. "Get up," Matteo instructed, tossing the bloodied tissue into the wastebasket. "Go take a shower. The maids will be here in 20 minutes. Sophia looked up at him. The reality of the transaction, the crude biological proof required by the men who owned their lives, seemed to hit her all over again. She didn't look relieved that she had been spared. She looked deeply nauseated by the mechanics of the lie. "You cut yourself?" she whispered, her voice fragile. "It heals." Matteo said, his tone flat, dismissing the concern. He walked to the closet to pull out a fresh shirt. "Go. The water gets cold if you wait too long." She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the carpet silently, and vanished into the bathroom. A moment later, the heavy sound of water hitting tile echoed through the suite. Matteo picked up the hotel phone and dialed the front desk. The water masked his conversation. He ordered breakfast eggs, cured meats, black coffee, and told the concierge they would be checking out by 9. Then he deliberately lowered his voice. "The sheets in the master suite need immediate changing," he said. The code was subtle, but the concierge, heavily tipped and carefully vetted by the syndicate, understood perfectly. "Right away, sir. Congratulations again." Matteo hung up a bitter taste in his mouth. When Sophia emerged from the bathroom 30 minutes later, the room service cart was already sitting in the small dining alcove. It smelled heavily of roasted espresso beans and salted pork. She had put her own clothes back on a simple conservative navy blue day dress. Her hair was brushed flat and wet against her scalp. Stripped of the bridal armor, she looked impossibly young. "Eat," Matteo ordered, pointing to the silver cloches. She sat across from him at the small glass table. She reached for a piece of dry toast and nibbled the corner. Her eyes kept darting to his left arm. He had rolled the sleeve of his fresh white button-down over a new tight bandage. "They'll believe it?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on her plate. Matteo swallowed a mouthful of scalding, bitter coffee. It burned, waking up his sluggish nerves. "The concierge took the linens 10 minutes ago. My underboss will get the call from the hotel manager before we reach the lobby. By the time we get to my estate, it will be an established historical fact." Sophia swallowed hard, the dry toast visibly catching in her throat. "And if they find out?" Matteo set his cup down. The porcelain clinked sharply against the saucer, a harsh sound that made her shoulders tense. "They won't," Matteo said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the glass. "Unless you talk." "I wouldn't," she said quickly, the panic flaring back into her dark eyes. "I know." It wasn't a compliment. It was an accurate assessment of her survival instinct. "Listen to me. When we walk out of those doors, the performance begins. You are my wife. You are the woman who cemented the territory alliance. You don't look at the floor. You don't flinch when my men speak to you. You act like you belong next to me, because from now on you do. Do you understand?" Sophia stared at him. The sheer weight of the role he was handing her pressed down on the room. She nodded slowly. "Say it." Matteo pushed his voice, dropping to a low, demanding register. "I understand," she whispered. Matteo stood up, throwing a crumpled white linen napkin onto the tray. "Good. Put your shoes on. We're re-entering the world." The descent in the glass elevator was silent and ear-popping. They dropped 30 floors in less than a minute. Matteo stood shoulder to shoulder with Sophia. He didn't look at her, but he could feel the rigid tension vibrating off her body. As the digital floor counter ticked down to the lobby, he reached out and took her hand. Sophia jolted slightly, her fingers stiffening inside his grip. Her skin was still cold. "Relax your hand," he murmured, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the polished chrome doors. "We're newlyweds. You're supposed to look like you survived the night with a smile." She let out a shaky breath and forced her fingers to uncurl, letting her hand rest awkwardly in his. It felt like holding a mannequin's hand, but it would look right to the casual observer. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The hotel lobby was aggressively bright, flooded with morning sunlight bouncing off the marble floors. 2 men in dark, tailored suits were waiting near the revolving doors. They weren't hotel security. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a flattened nose named Carmine, stepped forward. He gave Matteo a brief, respectful nod, then cut his eyes down to Sofia. The look was entirely different, appraising, calculating, and vaguely predatory. Matteo's grip on Sofia's hand tightened instinctively. He shot Carmine a look so hard and flat that the other man immediately dropped his gaze to the floor. "Cars out front, boss," Carmine muttered. "Let's go," Matteo said, pulling Sofia forward. They walked through the revolving doors. The morning air hit them like a wet, hot towel. It smelled of exhaust-hot asphalt and the metallic tang of the city. A black, heavily armored SUV sat idling at the curb, taking up 2 valet spaces. Carmine opened the heavy rear door. It took visible effort. The door was lined with 2 inches of ballistic steel. Matteo guided Sofia in first, then climbed in beside her. The door slammed shut with a definitive airtight thunk, cutting off the noise of the street instantly. The interior of the SUV smelled strongly of expensive leather and faintly of gun oil. The windows were tinted so darkly that the bright morning outside looked bruised and purple. Carmine got into the driver's seat, putting the car in gear. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Straight home. Straight home. Matteo confirmed. The drive took 40 minutes. They left the dense grid of the city, transitioning onto the highway, heading toward the sprawling, isolated estates on the northern ridge. Sofia sat pressed against the passenger door, staring out the darkened window. She hadn't spoken a word since the hotel room. Matteo watched her reflection in the glass. She looked incredibly small against the heavy armor of the vehicle. He realized with a sudden jarring clarity exactly what he was bringing her into. She had lived in a gilded cage in Palermo, kept away from the blood and the business. Now she was moving into the epicenter of a war zone. The SUV slowed, turning off the main road onto a private winding asphalt drive. Thick old-growth trees lined the perimeter, completely obscuring the property from the street. A mile down the road they reached the gates. They were massive wrought-iron monstrosities, flanked by high stone walls, topped with discreet razor-wire coils. 2 men with automatic rifles, slung casually over their chests, stepped out of a reinforced guardhouse. They recognized the car, nodded to Carmine, and buzzed the gates open. The heavy iron swung inward with a mechanical groan. Sofia finally pulled her eyes away from the window and looked forward. Matteo saw her swallow hard. She wasn't stupid. She recognized a fortress when she saw one. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the heavy tires as they pulled up to the main house. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of concrete dark wood and bulletproof glass. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to withstand a siege. There were no flower beds, no welcoming touches, just sharp angles and tactical sight lines. The car stopped. Carmine killed the engine. Before Carmine could get out to open the door, Matteo leaned closer to Sofia. The scent of her lavender soap briefly cut through the smell of leather. "Look at me," he said quietly. She turned her head. Her eyes were wide, taking in the armed men patrolling the perimeter of the driveway. "This is my house," Matteo said, his voice low but firm. "Which means it is now your house. The men you see outside work for me. They die for me. And from this second forward, they answer to you as well." Sofia looked at him like he had just spoken in tongues. "They have guns. They have guns to keep people out," Matteo said bluntly. "Not to keep you in. You are not a prisoner here, Sofia. You are the Don's wife. If anyone looks at you sideways, if anyone disrespects you, you tell me. And I will end them. Is that clear?" It was the most violent vow of protection he had ever made, and he meant every word of it. Sophia stared at him, searching his face for the lie. She found none. The tight, terrified line of her mouth softened just a fraction. "Clear," she breathed. Matteo pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the humid air. He turned, offering her his unbandaged hand. Sophia looked at his hand for a long second. Then slowly she reached out and took it, stepping out of the armored car and onto the gravel of her new reality. The foyer of the estate was a cavern of dark slate and exposed concrete. Their footsteps didn't just echo, they clattered harsh and percussive, bouncing off the 30-foot ceilings. The air inside was 10 degrees cooler than the humid morning outside, heavily filtered and smelling faintly of industrial floor cleaner and stale cigar smoke. Sophia stood in the center of the vast space. She didn't look at the massive abstract painting on the far wall, nor the sweeping glass-paneled staircase. She looked at the floor. The polished slate reflected her posture. Shoulders pulled, tight hands clasped over her stomach. She looked like a hostage waiting to be processed. Matteo dropped his leather duffel onto a glass console table. It hit with a heavy metallic thud. A door down the hall opened, and the rhythmic tap of hard-soled shoes approached. A man stepped into the foyer. He was older than Matteo, in his late 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that couldn't hide the thick, brutal line of his shoulders. His hair was heavily salted with grey, slicked back meticulously. This was Dominic, Matteo's underboss, the man who handled the ledgers, the bribes, and the bodies that needed to disappear quietly. Dominic stopped a few feet away. His eyes swept over Matteo, briefly snagging on the thick white bandage wrapping his right hand before dropping to the fresh gauze visible beneath the rolled sleeve of his left arm. The corner of Dominic's mouth twitched a microscopic acknowledgement of the violence he assumed had taken place. Then Dominic shifted his gaze to Sophia. It was an autopsy of a look. He wasn't assessing her beauty. He was weighing her leverage, her threat level, her breaking point. Matteo felt the sudden violent urge to step between them and shatter Dominic's jaw. The protective instinct was completely irrational. Dominic was his most loyal man, but the heat rising in Matteo's chest didn't care about logic. Before Matteo could move, Sophia lifted her chin. She didn't smile. She didn't offer her hand. She met Dominic's dead, calculating stare, with eyes that were bruised by exhaustion, but entirely lucid. She remembered Matteo's instruction in the car. You don't look at the floor. You don't flinch. The silence stretched thick and testing. A full 10 seconds passed. The air conditioning hummed loudly overhead. Finally, Dominic dipped his head. It wasn't a bow, just a minimal grudging concession of hierarchy. "Welcome to the estate, Signora." He rasped his voice, sounding like boots grinding on gravel. "Thank you," Sophia said. Her voice was terribly thin, a reed in a windstorm, but it didn't shake. Matteo let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He shot Dominic a hard, flat look. "We need the property locked down for the next 48 hours. No unannounced deliveries. Move the perimeter patrols to 2-man teams." Dominic nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. "Consider it done. The bosses called an hour ago. The sheets satisfied the requirement. The treaty is cemented." "Good," Matteo said cleanly. He turned to Sophia, touching the small of her back. The muscles along her spine were coiled tight as a spring. Upstairs. He guided her up the glass staircase. The second floor was just as stark as the first. No family photos, no warm rugs. They stopped at the end of the long corridor, in front of a heavy mahogany double door. Matteo pushed it open. The master suite was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a dark, dense line of pine trees. The bed was a low platform frame dominated by dark grey linens. It looked more like a slab in a morgue than a place to sleep. Sophia walked in slowly, her eyes tracking the severe lines of the furniture. Matteo walked past her, opening a side door. This is the primary bath. Through that door is another bedroom. It's smaller, but it has its own lock. Sophia turned around confused. For guests? For me, Matteo said. He watched her process the information, the slow blink of her dark eyes, the slight parting of her lips. She looked at the massive grey bed, then back at him. I don't sleep well, Matteo said, stripping the excuse of any emotion. He walked over to the windows and pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut, plunging the room into a cool, artificial dusk. I keep odd hours. I make calls. You need space, and I need you rested, so you don't look like a ghost when my captains come to the house. It was a lie. He slept perfectly fine when he wasn't sharing a zip code with a terrified 20-year-old who made him hyper-aware of the blood on his hands. He was giving her the master suite because the thought of forcing her to share a mattress with him, to lie stiff and terrified in the dark while he breathed next to her, made his stomach turn. Sophia looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her navy dress. You don't have to give up your room. It's already done, Matteo said firmly. He walked toward the adjoining door. There are clothes in the closet. Beatrice, the housekeeper, bought them yesterday. If you need anything, pick up the house phone. Dial 0. He stopped in the doorway, his hand resting on the brass knob. He looked back at her. She stood in the center of the massive dark room, looking entirely swallowed by the shadows and the silence. Lock the door, Sophia, he said softly. He stepped into the adjoining room and pulled the heavy mahogany shut behind him. He stood in the dark, listening. 5 seconds later, he heard the heavy metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place. Matteo closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of the door. The sound of the lock didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an accusation. 3 days bled into 4. They lived in the brutalist concrete house, like two ghosts haunting the same hallway, careful never to intersect for too long. They ate dinner at opposite ends of a sprawling dining table. Sophia learned the schedules of the armed guards. Matteo watched her from his study window as she paced the walled garden in the afternoons, looking up at the razor wire like a bird calculating the height of its cage. She played the part perfectly when required. When his lieutenants came to the house to deliver cash drops or report on the docks, Sophia sat in the parlor, wearing the austere, expensive clothes Beatrice had purchased. She poured espresso. She didn't flinch when men with visible shoulder holsters sat on the white couches. She became a beautiful, untouchable piece of furniture, a pristine asset. It was sickening. It was past 1 a.m. on a Thursday. The house was dead quiet, save for the mechanical hum of the central air and the distant rhythmic chirp of cicadas outside the bulletproof glass. Matteo sat behind the massive oak desk in his study. The room smelled of old paper leather and the harsh bite of antiseptic. A glass of scotch sat untouched next to a stack of shipping manifests. He was trying to change the bandage on his left arm. He had done a sloppy job making the cut. The blade had been sharp, but he had dragged it too deep in his haste to produce the blood for the hotel sheets. The 3-inch slice was inflamed the edges, an angry, puffy red. He held a piece of gauze soaked in alcohol, gritting his teeth as he pressed it against the raw tissue. His right hand, the one with the bruised, splintered knuckles, was stiff, making the task clumsy and infuriating. The heavy door to the study clicked open. Matteo's right hand shot to the open drawer of his desk, his fingers brushing the cold grip of his pistol before his brain registered the figure in the doorway. It was Sophia. She was wearing a long, oversized grey cashmere sweater that hung past her thighs, swallowing her completely. Her bare feet were soundless on the Persian rug. She froze when she saw his hand hovering over the drawer, her eyes darting to the gun, then up to his face. Matteo slowly pulled his hand back, resting it flat on the desk. His pulse thrummed heavily in his ears. "You should be asleep." "I heard you swearing," she said. Her voice was quiet, a stark contrast to the rough, violent men who usually occupied this room. She walked closer, her eyes fixing on the mess of bloody gauze medical tape and the bottle of iodine sitting on his desk. She stopped at the edge of the oak wood, looking at the angry red gash on his forearm. "It's infected," she stated, her tone entirely clinical. "It's fine. It just needs to be cleaned," Matteo muttered, picking up a fresh square of gauze with his clumsy, stiff right hand. He fumbled, dropping the white square onto the ledgers. Sophia didn't ask for permission. She walked around the side of the desk. She smelled faintly of that same lavender soap, but the scent of fear that usually accompanied it was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. She reached out and took the roll of tape from his hand. "Sit back," she ordered. Matteo stared at her. The proximity was jarring. For 4 days they had kept a strict, unspoken distance of at least 5 feet. Now her hip was pressed against the armrest of his leather chair. He leaned back, letting out a harsh exhale through his nose. He offered his left arm. Sophia picked up the bottle of iodine. She didn't warn him this time. She poured it directly over the open wound. The burn was absolute agony. A white-hot spike of pain shot up to Matteo's shoulder. His jaw clamped shut with an audible pop, the cartilage grinding. The muscles in his arm bunched and twitched involuntarily, but he didn't pull away. Sophia took a cotton swab and began meticulously cleaning the edges of the cut. Her fingers brushed against the unbroken skin of his forearm. Her touch was feather-light, a maddening contrast to the brutal stinging of the antiseptic. "You cut it too deep," she murmured, her eyes focused intently on her work. "I was in a hurry," Matteo said, his voice a low, gravelly scrape in the quiet room. "You're going to have a scar." Matteo let out a dry, humorless breath. He looked down at his chest, hidden beneath his dark shirt, mapped with the violent history of his life. "One more won't make a difference." Sophia stopped swabbing. She didn't look up, but her hands stilled over his arm. "My father called today. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Matteo's eyes hardened, focusing on the top of her dark head. "Did he?" "He spoke to Dominic." "Not to me," she said, her voice flattening out, losing its subtle warmth. "He wanted to make sure the alliance was holding. He wanted to make sure you were satisfied with the transaction." Matteo felt a surge of pure, unfiltered disgust. He looked at her delicate wrists, the pale skin illuminated by the desk lamp. "What did Dominic tell him?" "He told him I was a quiet, obedient wife," Sophia said. She finally looked up. Her dark eyes met his, and for the first time there was no terror in them. There was only a hollow, aching emptiness. "Is that what I am? Matteo? A quiet, obedient ghost in your house?" The question hit him squarely in the chest. It wasn't an accusation. It was a desperate plea for reality in a house built entirely on lies. He looked at her standing there, in the oversized sweater, holding a piece of bloody gauze, fixing the wound he had inflicted on himself to save her from the bed they were supposed to share. "When we are out there," Matteo said, gesturing vaguely to the window, to the world beyond the gates, "you are whatever they need to see to keep you alive. You are the Don's wife. Untouchable." He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. He could see the faint violet shadows under her eyes. "But in here," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, stripping away the armor, the titles, and the syndicate politics. "In this house. You don't have to be a ghost. You don't have to be obedient. If you want to scream, scream. If you want to break the china, break it. But stop looking at me like I'm waiting for the right moment to butcher you." Sophia stared at him, her breath hitching slightly. The raw intensity of his words hung in the space between them, heavy and undeniable. Slowly her gaze dropped back to his arm. She picked up a fresh roll of gauze and began to wrap the wound, pulling the white fabric tight, binding the flesh, and anchoring them both to the bleeding reality of the night. August hit the estate like a wet woolen blanket. The heat finally broke on a Tuesday afternoon, replaced by a violent thunderstorm that rolled off the northern ridge. The sky turned the color of an old bruise, purplish black and heavy. Rain lashed against the bulletproof glass of the study with the sound of gravel being thrown. Matteo stood by the window watching the water warp the view of the perimeter wall. The barometric pressure made the healed scar on his left arm ache. A dull phantom throb pulsing in time with the thunder. Behind him, the heavy oak door opened. It wasn't the hesitant barefoot step he had grown accustomed to listening for. It was the deliberate tread of hard-soled leather. Matteo didn't turn around. He recognized the gate. "What is it, Dominic?" "We have a leak," Dominic said. His voice cut through the ambient noise of the storm, harsh and grating. "Not money. Information." Matteo turned. Dominic stood in the center of the Persian rug. Rain dripped from the shoulders of his dark trench coat, soaking into the wool. He looked grim. "Explain," Matteo said, crossing to his desk. "The maids," Dominic stated flatly. "Beatrice runs a tight ship, but she can't sew their mouths shut. The girls who clean the second floor talk to the guards. The guards talk to the soldiers." Dominic paused, his jaw tightening. He looked directly into Matteo's eyes. "They talk about the locked door, the untouched bed in the master suite, the fact that the Don sleeps in the guest room." The air in the study stalled. The white noise of the rain suddenly seemed miles away, and Matteo challenged his voice, dropping to a silken, dangerous whisper. Dominic didn't back down. He was a veteran of the life. He knew the cost of weakness. "And it makes you look soft, Matteo. It makes the alliance look like a sham. The Palermo bosses gave you the girl to secure the bloodline. If the streets think you haven't touched her, they think you're rejecting the treaty. It's blood in the water. The Rossi loyalists are already whispering." A cold, familiar rage uncoiled in Matteo's chest. Surgical. Lethal. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't yell. He simply grabbed the lapels of Dominic's wet coat, his scarred right hand, twisting the fabric tight, and shoved the older man backward. Dominic hit the mahogany bookshelf with a heavy, bone-rattling thud. 2 leather-bound ledgers toppled off the edge, smacking the floor. "Let them whisper." Matteo snarled his face inches from Dominic's. The smell of wet wool and stale cigarette smoke filled his nose. "I run this family. Not the maids. Not the soldiers. And not you. You're protecting an asset at the cost of the empire." Dominic choked out his hands, coming up to grip Matteo's wrists to brace himself. "She's a syndicate daughter. She's built for it. Stop treating her like glass, or someone else will break her just to prove a point." "Dominic!" The voice didn't come from Matteo. It came from the doorway. Matteo froze. He didn't let go of the coat, but he turned his head. Sophia stood in the open doorway. She wasn't wearing the oversized cashmere sweater. She wore a tailored black dress, the fabric structured and severe, cutting off exactly at her knees. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, unforgiving knot, at the nape of her neck. She looked terrifyingly composed. She walked into the room. Her black heels clicked sharply against the hardwood. She didn't look at the gun holstered on Dominic's hip or the violent way Matteo had the older man pinned. She walked straight to Matteo's side. "Let him go," she said, quietly. Matteo's jaw ground tight. Every instinct screamed at him to physically shield her, to push her out of the room and lock the door. But he looked at her eyes. They weren't frantic. They were dark, entirely lucid, and flashing with a cold, absolute authority. Slowly, Matteo released his grip. He stepped back, the adrenaline souring in his stomach. Dominic straightened his coat, clearing his throat eyes, darting between them. Sophia turned her attention to the underboss. She didn't tilt her chin up to compensate for her height. She simply looked at him. "The maids will be fired this afternoon," Sophia said. Her voice was smooth, devoid of any tremble. "Beatrice will hire a new crew from outside the territory. They will not speak Italian. And if I hear that one of your soldiers is discussing my marriage again, Dominic, you will cut out his tongue and bring it to me on a silver tray. Is that understood?" Dominic stared at her. The brutal medieval poetry of the threat hit him like a physical blow. He looked at Matteo, seeking a retraction. Matteo stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He said nothing. He let the silence endorse her. "Understood, Signora," Dominic muttered. He turned and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The latch clicked loudly. The storm outside cracked a massive peal of thunder, shaking the floorboards. As soon as the door closed, the rigid posture drained out of Sophia. Her shoulders dropped. She reached out, gripping the edge of the heavy oak desk. Her knuckles went white. Matteo watched her chest heave, the sudden intake of oxygen, betraying the sheer, terrifying cost of the performance. "You didn't have to do that," Matteo said, his voice rough. "Yes, I did," Sophia breathed, looking down at the polished wood. "He was right. If they think you're weak because of me, they'll kill you." She finally looked up at him. The mask was gone. She was just Sophia again. But the fear in her eyes wasn't for herself anymore. It was for him. The realization hit Matteo with the force of a train. He had spent the last month trying to lock her away from the reality of what he was. But she didn't want the glass box. She had stepped directly into the line of fire to protect him. Matteo closed the distance between them. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out, sliding his hand to the back of her neck, his thumb resting against the frantic pulse at her throat. Her skin was warm. Sophia let out a small, shuddering gasp. She didn't flinch away. Instead, her hands came up, grabbing the front of his dark shirt. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead heavily against the center of his chest. Matteo wrapped his other arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of lavender and the sharp tang of the storm. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a contract. It was a messy, desperate clinging in the center of a heavily armed fortress. They were two people standing on the bleeding edge of a violent world, terrified, deeply flawed, and finally holding on.